In a small Pennsylvania town, a single father working 3 jobs to keep a roof over his daughter's head made a choice that would change everything. Dan Cooper had exactly 47 minutes to complete the repair job that would cover his rent when he spotted an elderly woman standing alone at a bus stop, confusion written across her weathered face as the temperature dropped toward freezing. Everyone else walked past her like she was invisible, but Dan stopped. He didn't know that the lost, frightened woman clutching a tattered purse was Beatrice Thornton, the reclusive billionaire, whose family foundation owned half the businesses in town, including the very apartment building where Dan faced eviction. He didn't know that her mind was slipping away piece by piece, or that her son had written her off as a burden. All Dan knew was that someone needed help, and despite having nothing to spare, he gave everything he had. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The November. Wind in morning glory, Pennsylvania carried the kind of cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, settling deep in your bones and staying there long after you'd found shelter. Street lamps flickered on early against the grey afternoon sky, casting weak pools of yellow light on sidewalks already dusted with the first hints of winter. Most folks hurried past with their heads down, breath visible in small puffs as they made their way home from work, eager to escape the biting air. Dan Cooper pulled his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders as he jogged down Pine Street, his work boots splashing through shallow puddles left from the morning's freezing rain. His toolbox rattled in his left hand, while his right clutched a crumpled piece of paper with an address and a phone number. Mrs. Peterson's kitchen sink had backed up again, and she'd called him in a panic about water spreading across her floor. It was the 3rd emergency call this week, and if he could fix it before 6 o'clock, the $60 would be enough to cover what he still owed on rent. The math played over and over in his head as he walked. 47 minutes to get to Elm Street, diagnose the problem, fix it, collect payment, and get back to Riverside Apartments before Mrs. Jackson locked up the office. 47 minutes to keep Zoe from having to sleep in Rick's garage again. 47 minutes to maintain what little stability his 8-year-old daughter had left in her world. The bus stop at Pine and 3rd sat in the shadow of Morning Glory's old brick library, a weathered bench beneath a rusted shelter that provided little protection from the elements. Dan had passed this spot hundreds of times over the years, usually without giving it much thought, but today something made him slow his pace. An elderly woman stood beside the bench, not sitting, just standing perfectly still in a way that looked wrong somehow. She wore a long beige coat that had seen better decades, and her silver hair escaped from beneath a knitted hat that might have been white once, but had faded to the color of old snow. Her hands gripped a brown leather purse so tightly her knuckles showed white through papery skin. Dan glanced at his watch. 44 minutes now. He needed to keep moving, needed to get to Mrs. Peterson's before the hardware store closed, and he couldn't get the parts he might need. But the woman turned slightly, and he caught sight of her face. Her eyes held a look he recognized. The same confused fear Zoe had worn on her first day at a new school when they'd moved apartments for the 3rd time in 2 years. The woman looked up the street, then down it, then up again. Her mouth moved slightly, forming words Dan couldn't hear over the wind. She took a step toward the curb, hesitated, then stepped back. A middle-aged man in a business suit walked past her without slowing down. A woman with grocery bags shifted them to one arm to check her phone, never lifting her eyes. 2 teenagers laughed loudly as they passed, their conversation about weekend plans continuing uninterrupted. Dan stopped walking entirely. The woman noticed him looking and offered a small, uncertain smile that seemed to apologize for existing. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying across the few yards between them. "Are you all right?" She blinked several times, as if trying to bring him into focus. "I think I might have missed my bus," she said, her voice soft and unsteady. "Or perhaps it hasn't come yet. I'm not quite sure about the time." Dan approached slowly, the way he would with a lost animal that might bolt if startled. "What bus are you waiting for?" "The number 12, I believe." "Or was it the 14? She opened her purse and began rummaging through it with increasing agitation. "I have my schedule somewhere. I always keep it right here, but nothing seems to be where I left it anymore." The contents of her purse spilled slightly as she searched. Dan caught sight of tissues, a small coin purse, reading glasses in a cracked case, and what looked like several business cards held together with a rubber band. No bus schedule, no wallet that he could see, no phone. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked gently. She looked up at him with eyes that were sharp one moment and clouded the next. "Home," she said simply. "I just want to go home, but I can't seem to remember." Her voice trailed off, and she looked around as if seeing the street for the first time. Dan checked his watch again. 41 minutes. Mrs. Peterson was probably watching water spread across her kitchen floor right now, wondering where the handyman she'd called was. The $60 he needed was slipping away with every passing second, but this woman looked so lost, so fragile, standing there in the cold wind. "Do you remember your address?" he asked. She brightened slightly. "Oh yes, I live on Beacon Hill. Such a lovely view from the windows. Robert always said it was the finest view in all of Pennsylvania." Her expression grew sad. "Though Robert isn't with us anymore." Beacon Hill. Dan knew the area, or knew of it anyway. It was the wealthy section of Morning Glory, where the old families lived behind iron gates and tall hedges. The houses up there probably cost more than Dan would make in 10 lifetimes. This woman didn't look wealthy, though. Her coat was clean but old, her shoes sensible but worn. Maybe she worked up there, a housekeeper or caretaker. "That's quite a ways from here," Dan said carefully. "The buses don't run up to Beacon Hill very often, especially not this late in the day." "Oh." She looked so disappointed that Dan felt something twist in his chest. "I suppose I'll have to call someone then, though I'm not sure who." She opened her purse again and began the same fruitless search. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the pavement and making the woman shiver despite her coat. Dan thought about Zoe, probably sitting at Rebecca Parker's kitchen table right now, doing homework and wondering when her dad would pick her up. Rebecca only watched her until 6:30, and she had her own family to worry about. "Mom, do you have any identification with you? Something with your address on it?" She patted her coat pockets, then looked in her purse again. "I must have left my wallet at home. I do that sometimes lately. Things slip my mind." She looked up at him with sudden clarity. "You're very kind to help me. Most people just walk, as if I'm not even here." Dan's throat tightened. 38 minutes now. But he couldn't leave her here, not when the temperature was dropping and she had no way to get home. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Peterson. "Mrs. Peterson, it's Dan Cooper. I'm running a little behind, but I should be there within the hour. Can you hold off until then?" He listened to her response, his stomach sinking. "I understand. Yes, if you need to call someone else, I understand completely." He hung up and stared at the phone for a moment. $60. Gone. Along with his own chance to make rent on time. "Is everything all right, dear?" the woman asked, noticing his expression. Dan forced a smile. "Everything's fine. Let me help you get home." He looked around, thinking. No buses, no taxi service in Morning Glory, and he didn't have money for the one car service that operated out of the next town over. But Rick's garage was only 3 blocks away, and Rick owed him a favor. "Stay right here for just a minute, okay? I'm going to arrange a ride for you." Her face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Oh, you don't have to do that. I couldn't ask you to go to such trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Dan said, already dialing Rick's number. Rick, it's Dan. I need a huge favor. There's an elderly woman stranded at the Pine Street bus stop, and she needs to get up to Beacon Hill. Could you possibly... He listened, hope fading. I see. No, I understand. Thanks anyway. Rick's truck was in pieces in the garage bay, and his wife had taken their car to pick up the kids from daycare. Dan looked at the woman, who was watching him with the patient expression of someone used to disappointment, but still hoping for the best. The wind gusted harder, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. In the distance, Dan could see the first snowflakes beginning to fall, tiny white specks that would soon accumulate on the cold ground. He thought about Zoe waiting for him, about the rent money he'd just lost, about the very real possibility that they'd be looking for a new place to live by the end of the week. Then he looked at the woman's face again, at the way she stood so straight despite her obvious confusion, maintaining her dignity even as the world seemed to have forgotten she existed. "Ma'am," he said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I'm going to walk you home. It's going to take a while, but I'll make sure you get there safely." Her eyes filled with tears. "You would do that? For a stranger?" "You're not a stranger," Dan said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "You're someone who needs help, and that's enough." As they began walking toward Beacon Hill, neither of them knowing it would take nearly 2 hours to reach her destination, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would matter more than any plumbing repair ever could. Behind them, the bus stop grew smaller in the gathering dusk, and ahead lay a journey that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The snow fell steadier now, fat flakes that clung to their shoulders and melted against their faces as Dan and Beatrice made their way through the winding streets leading away from downtown Morning Glory. What had started as a light dusting was quickly becoming the season's first real snowfall, turning the sidewalks slick and the world around them into a hushed, white-wrapped cocoon. Dan shortened his stride to match Beatrice's careful steps, keeping one hand ready to steady her if she slipped. She moved with the deliberate caution of someone who understood their own fragility, but there was a determined set to her shoulders that spoke of a woman who had faced worse than a snowy evening walk. "I hope I'm not keeping you from your family," Beatrice said as they paused at a street corner, waiting for a pickup truck to roll past, with its headlights cutting through the early darkness. "My daughter's being looked after," Dan replied, though he could feel his phone buzzing with what was probably a text from Rebecca asking when he'd be by to collect Zoe. "She's safe and warm, which is what matters." Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. "What's her name?" "Zoe. She's 8. Dan found himself smiling despite their circumstances. Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn as her old man. 8 is a wonderful age, old enough to have real conversations, young enough to still believe in magic. Beatrice's voice carried a wistful quality. "I remember when my grandson was 8. He used to build these elaborate forts in the living room using all the couch cushions and dining room chairs. Robert would pretend to be terribly annoyed, but he was always the first one to crawl inside and hear whatever grand adventure Michael had planned for the day." Something in her tone made Dan glance over at her. "Michael's your grandson?" "Was." The single word hung in the cold air between them. "Car accident 3 years ago. He was 17, just learning to drive. Sometimes I still catch myself listening for his footsteps on the stairs." Dan felt the familiar ache that came with unexpected grief, the kind that reminded you how quickly everything you loved could disappear. "I'm sorry, I can't imagine." It broke something in his father, in Andrew. Beatrice pulled her coat tighter as they turned onto a street lined with older houses, their windows glowing warmly against the snowy evening. "We used to be close, Andrew and I. But after Michael died, he seemed to blame me for something. Or maybe he just couldn't bear to look at me because I reminded him too much of what we'd lost. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, their footsteps muffled by the accumulating snow. Dan found himself stealing glances at his companion, trying to reconcile her obvious refinement with her current situation. She spoke like someone educated, carried herself with the bearing of a woman accustomed to respect, yet here she was, wandering alone and confused with no way to get home. "Beatrice," he said carefully, "forgive me for asking, but do you live alone, up on Beacon Hill?" She was quiet for so long that Dan began to worry he'd overstepped. When she finally answered, her voice was smaller than before. "There's Rebecca. She's my helper, I suppose you'd call her, though I prefer to think of her as a friend. She makes sure I take my medications and helps me remember appointments. Sometimes she helps me remember other things too. Does she?" "No, you're out here?" I told her I was going for a walk. I often walk in the afternoons when the weather's nice. But today I kept walking, and somehow I ended up downtown, and then I couldn't quite remember which direction led home. She paused, looking around at the unfamiliar neighborhood. "I seem to get turned around more often lately. Rebecca says it's normal at my age, but it's frightening when you can't trust your own mind." Dan's phone buzzed again. This time he pulled it out and saw 3 missed texts from Rebecca Parker and one from Mrs. Jackson at his apartment building. His stomach dropped as he read Mrs. Jackson's message. "Office closes at 6. Need payment by then or locks change tomorrow morning." It was already past 6:30. "Everything all right?" Beatrice asked, noticing his expression. Dan forced a smile and put the phone away. "Just work stuff. Nothing that can't wait." They continued climbing the gentle slope that led toward Beacon Hill, passing through a middle-class neighborhood where children's bicycles sat abandoned on front lawns and jack-o'-lanterns from Halloween still grinned from porches. The snow was coming down harder now, and Dan could see Beatrice was tiring, despite her efforts to keep up. "Would you like to rest for a minute?" he suggested, as they approached a small park with a covered pavilion. "That might be wise," she admitted, and they made their way to the shelter. Beatrice settled onto a bench with obvious relief, while Dan checked his phone again. 7 messages now. Rebecca Parker had called twice and sent increasingly worried texts. Mrs. Thornton never came back from her walk. "Have you seen her?" "Getting really concerned now. She's never been gone this long." "About to call the police." "Beatrice," Dan said gently, "I think someone named Rebecca is worried about you. She's been trying to find you." Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my goodness, I completely forgot to tell her where I was going. She must be beside herself with worry." She looked at Dan with sudden clarity. "Do you have her number? Could we call her?" Dan scrolled through the messages until he found Rebecca's contact information. He dialed and she answered on the first. "Ring, Rebecca Parker. Ms. Parker, this is Dan Cooper. I'm with Beatrice Thornton. She's safe, and I'm walking her home right now." The relief in Rebecca's voice was palpable. "Oh, thank God. Mrs. Thornton, are you all right?" Dan handed the phone to Beatrice, who took it with slightly shaking hands. "Rebecca, dear, I'm so sorry. I went for a walk and got completely turned around. This lovely young man found me and is helping me get home." "Where are you now?" Rebecca's voice was loud enough for Dan to hear. Beatrice looked around uncertainly. "I'm not quite sure. Dan, where are we?" "Maple Park near 7th Street, Dan said, leaning closer to the phone. "That's at least a mile from home and it's snowing hard," Rebecca said. "Mrs. Thornton, can you wait there? I'll come get you." "Actually," Dan interjected, "we're making good progress. It might be easier if we just continue on foot. The roads are getting slippery for driving." There was a pause before Rebecca responded. Mr. Cooper, I appreciate what you're doing, but Mrs. Thornton has some health conditions that make walking long distances inadvisable. If you could just stay where you are. I'm perfectly fine, Rebecca, Beatrice said with a touch of her earlier dignity. A little cold perhaps, but Dan is taking excellent care of me. We'll be home soon. After some back and forth, Rebecca reluctantly agreed to meet them halfway, at the entrance to the Beacon Hill neighborhood. Dan helped Beatrice to her feet, and they continued their journey through the increasingly snowy evening. You didn't have to do that, Beatrice said as they walked. Insist on continuing, I mean. Rebecca could have picked me up. I said I'd walk you home, and I meant it, Dan replied. Besides, I'm enjoying the company. And surprisingly, he was. Despite the cold and the snow and the growing certainty that he'd lost his apartment, there was something peaceful about this. Walk with a woman who asked thoughtful questions and listened to his answers as if they mattered. When was the last time someone had asked him about Zoe and actually wanted to hear the details? When had anyone cared about his dreams or his struggles beyond how they might benefit from his labor? Tell me about your work, Beatrice said as they navigated around a particularly slippery patch of sidewalk. I fix things mostly. Plumbing, electrical work, carpentry when I can get it, whatever people need and are willing to pay for. Dan paused, then added, It's not steady, but it's honest work, and I'm good at it. I'm sure you are. You have capable hands. She gestured toward his work-worn fingers. And you think before you act, those are valuable qualities. Not valuable enough, apparently, Dan said before he could stop himself. What do you mean? Dan hesitated, then found himself telling this near stranger about the constant juggling act of his life. The 3 part-time jobs that never quite added up to enough money. The apartment he was about to lose. The fear that kept him awake at night, wondering if he was failing Zoe by not being able to provide the stability she deserved. And tonight, by helping me, you've made your situation worse, Beatrice said quietly. No, Dan said firmly. Tonight I did the right thing. Sometimes that costs more than you can afford, but you do it anyway. They had reached the foot of Beacon Hill now, where the modest houses of the lower neighborhoods gave way to larger properties, set back from the road behind stone walls and wrought iron fences. Street lamps here were farther apart but more elegant, casting pools of light that turned the falling snow into something magical. A car approached from up the hill, its headlights sweeping across them as it pulled to the curb. A woman in her 30s got out, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Mrs. Thornton, there you are. I've been so worried. Rebecca Parker was tall and athletic-looking, with short brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved quickly to Beatrice's side, checking her over with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. I'm perfectly fine, Rebecca. Just a little adventure, that's all. Beatrice turned to Dan with a warm smile. This is Dan Cooper, the gentleman who rescued me from my own confusion. Rebecca extended a hand to Dan, her grip firm and grateful. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Cooper. When she didn't come home by dark, I was imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios. Anyone would have done the same, Dan said, though they all knew that wasn't true. Let's get you inside and warmed up. Rebecca said to Beatrice. She looked at Dan. Can I give you a ride somewhere? It's the least I can do. Dan was about to accept when Beatrice spoke up. Nonsense. Dan is coming in for tea and something warm to eat. I insist. She looked at him with an expression that brooked no argument. It's the very least I can do to repay your kindness. Rebecca looked uncertain. Mrs. Thornton, I'm not sure. I'm sure, Beatrice said with quiet authority. Dan, I won't hear any protests. You've spent your evening taking care of me, and now it's my turn to take care of you. As they walked up, the winding driveway toward a house that emerged from the snowy darkness like something from a fairy tale. Dan felt as if he was stepping into a different world entirely. Behind them, the lights of morning glory twinkled in the valley below, and ahead lay answers to questions he hadn't even known he should be asking. The Thornton house rose from the snowy landscape like a monument to a different era. It's Georgian colonial architecture, speaking of old money and established roots. Warm light spilled from tall windows onto manicured grounds where ancient oak trees stood sentinel against the winter sky. Dan had driven past places like this before when doing odd jobs in the better neighborhoods, but he'd never imagined walking through the front door as a guest. Rebecca produced a set of keys and led them up the brick steps to a heavy wooden door adorned with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The entrance hall beyond took Dan's breath away. A crystal chandelier cast prisms of light across marble floors, while an elegant staircase curved upward to a second floor that seemed to stretch on forever. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and fresh flowers arranged in a crystal vase filled the air with the scent of roses despite the season. "Good heavens, it's cold in here," Beatrice said, unwrapping her scarf with fingers that trembled slightly from more than just the temperature. "Rebecca, could you ask James to check the heating system? It shouldn't be this chilly inside." Rebecca and Dan exchanged a glance. "Mrs. Thornton," Rebecca said gently, "James isn't here. He lives in Philadelphia now, remember? I'll adjust the thermostat myself." A shadow crossed Beatrice's face. Confusion mixed with something that looked like grief. "Of course, I don't know why I said that." She turned to Dan with visible effort to refocus. "Please, let me take your coat. You must be frozen through." Dan hesitated, suddenly aware of how his worn work clothes and scuffed boots looked in these elegant surroundings. "Maybe I should just head home. I don't want to impose." "Absolutely not." Beatrice's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to having her wishes respected. "You've done me an enormous kindness, and I intend to return it properly." Rebecca appeared at his elbow, her manner professionally warm. "She's right, Mr. Cooper. Please let me take your jacket. And don't worry about your boots. These floors have seen much worse than a little snow." As Rebecca led them toward what she called the sitting room, Dan caught glimpses of other spaces that seemed to go on forever. A dining room with a table that could seat 20 people. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and ladder on wheels. Through another doorway, he spotted what looked like a music room with a grand piano positioned near tall windows. The sitting room itself was more intimate than the entrance hall, but no less impressive. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, large enough for Dan to stand upright inside, while comfortable chairs and sofas were arranged to take advantage of both the warmth and the view of the gardens beyond. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood. Floors and the walls displayed what Dan suspected were original paintings, not prints. "Please sit wherever you're comfortable," Beatrice said, settling into a wing-back chair near the fire. "Rebecca, could you bring us some tea, and perhaps some of those sandwiches you made earlier?" "Of course." Rebecca paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Thornton, have you taken your evening medications yet?" "I don't believe so, though honestly I'm not entirely certain what day it is, let alone what pills I've taken." Beatrice laughed, but there was an edge of frustration in it. "This getting old business is more complicated than anyone tells you when you're young." After Rebecca left, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Dan found himself studying his hostess more carefully in the firelight. Despite her earlier confusion and the obvious signs of age, there was something regal about the way she held herself, a natural grace that spoke of a lifetime of confidence and authority. "This is quite a place," he said finally. "It's been in Robert's family for nearly a century," Beatrice replied, following his gaze around the room. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just borrowing it even after all these years." Robert inherited it from his father, who built most of the additions you see now. The original house was much smaller. How long have you lived here? 43 years come March. Robert brought me here as a bride, and I was terrified I'd break something expensive just by walking through the rooms. She smiled at the memory. I grew up in a row house in South Philadelphia. My father worked in the shipyards, and my mother took in sewing to make ends meet. This place might as well have been Buckingham Palace to me. Dan leaned forward, intrigued. How did you meet Robert? At a church social of all places. I was working as a secretary at an insurance company, and a friend dragged me along to some fundraiser her church was hosting. Robert was there because his mother had insisted. Apparently the Thornton family was expected to make an appearance at such events. Beatrice's eyes grew distant. He was so handsome in his Navy uniform. He'd just returned from overseas, and he had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Rebecca returned with a tea service that probably cost more than Dan made in a month, along with a tray of delicate sandwiches and what looked like homemade cookies. She poured for all three of them with practiced efficiency, then discreetly placed a small pill organizer beside Beatrice's cup. "Thank you, dear," Beatrice said, taking the pills without argument. "Rebecca takes wonderful care of me, Dan. I don't know what I'd do without her." "How long have you been working for Mrs. Thornton?" Dan asked Rebecca as she settled into her own chair with a cup of tea. 3 years now," Rebecca replied. "I was working at the hospital when Mrs. Thornton's doctor recommended she might benefit from some in-home assistance. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she adjusted to some new medications, but we seemed to suit each other well." "Rebecca is far too modest," Beatrice interjected. "She has a master's degree in social work and could be running her own agency by now. Instead, she's stuck here with an old woman who can't remember what day it is half the time." "I happen to like my job," Rebecca said firmly. "Besides, someone has to make sure you don't wander off in snowstorms." They shared a laugh, and Dan could see the genuine affection between the two women. It was more than just a professional relationship. There was real caring there, the kind that developed when people looked after each other through difficult times. "Dan," Beatrice said, turning her attention back to him, "tell me about your daughter, Zoe, was it?" Dan's face lit up the way it always did when someone asked about Zoe. "She's amazing, tough as nails, but still believes in fairy tales. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, or maybe a teacher, or possibly a professional ice cream taster. She changes her mind about once a week. And her mother?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Dan took a sip of tea, buying time. "Angela left when Zoe was 4. She found someone who could offer her a more stable life, and I couldn't argue with her reasoning. I was working construction then, gone 12 hours a day, struggling to keep up with bills. She tried to take Zoe with her, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The judge decided Zoe was better off with me." "That must have been difficult for everyone involved," Beatrice said with genuine sympathy. "It was. But Zoe's a resilient kid. She's adjusted better than I have, probably." Dan smiled. "She still talks to her mom on the phone sometimes, but she's never asked to go live with her. I count that as a win." "Where is Zoe tonight?" Rebecca asked, with a neighbor who watches her after school. "Mrs. Parker." Dan paused, realizing the coincidence. "Actually, she has the same last name as you, Rebecca. Anyway, she keeps Zoe until I get off work, helps her with homework, feeds her dinner. I don't know what I'd do without her generosity. People who care for children often have the biggest hearts," Beatrice observed. "It takes special people to open their homes to someone else's family." As if summoned by their conversation, Dan's phone rang. Rebecca Parker's name appeared on the screen. "I should take this," Dan said apologetically. "Mrs. Parker, I'm so sorry I'm late. I got caught up helping someone and—" "Dan, honey, it's fine," came Rebecca Parker's warm voice. "Zoe's already had dinner and finished her homework. She's watching a movie with my kids. But I am getting a little worried about you with this snow coming down. Are you somewhere safe?" Dan looked around the elegant sitting room, feeling surreal. "Yeah, I'm safe. I'm actually up on Beacon Hill with the lady I helped. I should be home in an hour or so." "Beacon Hill? My goodness, that's fancy. Well, don't worry about Zoe. She can stay here tonight if the roads get too bad. Just text me when you get home safe." After Dan hung up, Beatrice was studying him with renewed interest. "You have good people looking out for you," she said. "I'm lucky that way. Mrs. Parker has been a lifesaver since we moved to that neighborhood. She refuses to take much money for watching Zoe, says she's happy to help a working parent. And yet—" "You're struggling financially," Beatrice observed gently. "Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but earlier you mentioned missing a job tonight that would have helped with rent money." Dan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's not your fault. I made the choice to help you instead of rushing off to fix someone's sink. I knew what I was doing. But now you're in a difficult position because of that choice. I'll figure something out. I always do." Dan's voice was steady, but Rebecca noticed the tension in his shoulders. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "Dan, may I ask you something personal?" "Sure. What would you do if money weren't an issue? If you could provide Zoe with everything she needed without constantly worrying about the next paycheck?" Dan considered the question seriously. "I'd go back to school, probably. Get my contractor's license, maybe start my own business. I'm good with my hands, good at solving problems, but right now I can barely keep up with survival, let alone planning for the future." "And Zoe? What would change for her?" "Everything," Dan said without hesitation. "Better schools, maybe, music lessons. She's always wanted to learn piano, a bedroom of her own instead of sharing our one-bedroom apartment. Vacation sometimes, even if it's just camping. The chance to be a kid without worrying about whether we'll have enough money for school supplies." Beatrice nodded slowly, as if filing away his answers for future reference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 o'clock. Dan realized with a start that he'd been here for over an hour, longer than he'd spent in pleasant conversation with adults in months. "I should probably head home," he said reluctantly. "Mrs. Parker will worry if I'm out too much longer in this weather." "Of course," Beatrice said, though she looked disappointed. "Rebecca, could you call a taxi for Dan?" "Actually, I could drive him," Rebecca offered. "The roads might be getting slippery for walking." As they prepared to leave, Beatrice walked Dan to the front door, moving with careful dignity. In the entrance hall, she paused and turned to face him directly. "Dan," she said, her voice carrying a weight of sincerity, "I want you to know that what you did tonight, stopping to help a confused old woman when you had your own problems to worry about, that kind of kindness is rarer than you might think. You've reminded me that good people still exist in this world." "You would have done the same for someone else," Dan replied. Beatrice smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face. "I hope so. I truly hope so." She pressed something into his hand, a business card with elegant script. "This has my phone number on it. Please don't hesitate to call if you ever need anything. And I mean anything." Dan looked down at the card. In the center, printed in simple black letters, were the words Beatrice Thornton and a phone number. Nothing else. No company name, no title, just her name. But somehow, holding that card felt like holding a lifeline to a world he'd never imagined being part of. As Rebecca's car pulled away from the circular drive, Dan watched the house grow smaller in the side mirror, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy night. He had no idea that his act of simple kindness had planted a seed that would grow into something that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. 3 days after the snowstorm, Dan stood outside the locked door of his former apartment, holding 2 suitcases and a cardboard box that contained everything he and Zoe owned. The eviction notice taped to the door fluttered in the morning breeze, its official language stark against the cheerful yellow paint Mrs. Jackson had used to spruce up the building the previous spring. "Daddy, why can't we go inside?" Zoe asked, tugging at his jacket with one mittened hand while clutching her stuffed elephant with the other. "We have to find a new place to live, sweetheart," Dan said, crouching down to her level. "Remember how we talked about sometimes needing to move to new adventures?" Zoe's 8-year-old wisdom saw right through his attempt at optimism. "Is it because we don't have enough money again?" The question hit Dan like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was completely accurate. "Sometimes grown-up things are complicated, Zoe, but I promise we'll figure it out." They loaded their belongings into Rick's borrowed pickup truck and drove across town to Rick and Lisa's small house, where a fold-out couch in the living room would serve as their temporary home. Rick had insisted it was no trouble, that they were family, but Dan could see the strain it put on the young couple who were already stretching their own budget to cover Lisa's maternity leave. "It's just until I can get back on my feet," Dan assured Rick as they carried the boxes inside. "Maybe a week, 2 at most." "Take whatever time you need, brother," Rick said. But Dan caught him glancing toward the kitchen where Lisa was making a breakfast, one hand resting on her growing belly. By Thursday morning, Dan had applied for 12 apartments and been turned down for 11 of them. His credit wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either, and most landlords wanted first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit up front, money he simply didn't have. The 12th application was still pending for a basement efficiency. In the neighborhood where Zoe would have to change schools mid-year, he was walking back from another failed apartment viewing when his phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but something about it looked elegant, sophisticated. "Hello? Dan, this is Beatrice Thornton. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time." Dan stopped walking, surprised by how much pleasure he felt at hearing her. "Your voice. Mrs. Thornton, not at all. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." "The cold I caught from our snowy adventure cleared up nicely." Her voice carried a warmth that seemed to reach through the phone. "I was wondering if you might have time to visit this afternoon. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Dan glanced at his watch. He had a small electrical job scheduled for 3 o'clock, barely enough to pay for gas and groceries, but money he couldn't afford to turn down. "I'm actually working this afternoon, but I could come by afterward if that works." "Around 5:30. That would be perfect. Rebecca will have the gate open for you." As Dan hung up, he found himself curious about what Beatrice wanted to discuss. Their conversation the other night had been pleasant, even enlightening, but he couldn't imagine what business she might have with someone like him. The electrical job turned out to be more complex than expected. What should have been a simple outlet replacement revealed old wiring that needed extensive repair to meet current safety codes. The elderly homeowner, Mrs. Patterson, fretted about the cost until Dan assured her he could do the work for the price of materials plus $50 labor. "Are you sure?" she asked, peering at him over wire-rimmed glasses. "That seems like far too little for all this work." "It's fine," Dan said, already running late for his appointment with Beatrice. "I just want to make sure your house is safe." By the time he finished and cleaned up, it was nearly 6:15. He called Beatrice to apologize for the delay, but she assured him dinner could wait, that Rebecca had prepared plenty, and they'd be happy to have him join them. The Thornton estate looked different in the late afternoon light, less imposing somehow, more welcoming. Rebecca met him at the door with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him again. "Mrs. Thornton is in the conservatory," she said, leading him through parts of the house he hadn't seen before. "She's been looking forward to your visit." All day, the conservatory was a glass-walled room attached to the back of the house, filled with plants that thrived despite the November chill outside. Beatrice sat at a small table set for three, wearing a soft blue sweater that made her eyes look younger, more vibrant. "Dan, wonderful to see you again," she said, rising to greet him. "Please sit. I hope you don't mind that I asked Rebecca to join us. She's become quite curious about the man who rescued me from my own wandering." As they shared a dinner of herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables that tasted better than anything Dan had eaten in months, the conversation flowed naturally. Beatrice asked about Zoe's school, about Dan's work, about the small details of their daily life with genuine interest. Rebecca shared stories about her previous work at the hospital, and Dan found himself laughing more than he had in weeks. "Dan," Beatrice said as Rebecca cleared the dinner plates, "I have a proposition I'd like you to consider." Dan set down his water glass, suddenly alert. "What kind of proposition?" "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about your dreams for the future, your hopes for Zoe." Beatrice folded her hands on the table, her expression serious but kind. "I have a problem, and I believe you might be the solution." "I'm listening." "This house is too big for one old woman and her caretaker. It needs constant maintenance, repairs, updates to keep it functioning properly. I've been hiring different contractors for various jobs, but I never know if I'm getting quality work at fair prices. What I need is someone I can trust, someone who would take care of this place as if it were their own home." Dan felt his heart rate increase. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you several jobs, actually. Groundskeeper, maintenance supervisor, general handyman. The carriage house behind the main property has been empty for years. It's a lovely two-bedroom place that just needs some updating. You and Zoe, who could live there in exchange for your work. Plus, I'd pay you a fair wage for the repairs and maintenance." Dan stared at her, processing what she was suggesting. "Mrs. Thornton, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "Let me finish," she said gently. "I've done some research. I know you're facing eviction, that you're staying with friends temporarily. I know you're a skilled worker who charges far less than your expertise is worth. This isn't charity, Dan. This is a business arrangement that would benefit both of us." Rebecca leaned forward. "I've seen the work estimates she's been getting from other contractors. You'd actually be saving her money in the long run." "The carriage house has been sitting empty for 3 years," Beatrice continued. "It would be wonderful to see it lived in again, to have the sounds of a family bringing life to the property, and Zoe would be in the same school district, so no disruption to her education." Dan's mind raced through the implications. Stable housing, steady work, a chance to build something instead of constantly scrambling for survival. What exactly would the job entail? "Whatever needs doing," Beatrice said with a smile. "Fixing leaky faucets, maintaining the heating system, keeping the grounds tidy. Eventually, maybe some renovation projects if you're interested. The carriage house needs a new kitchen, and there are several rooms in the main house that haven't been updated since the 1980s. And you'd trust me with all of that? You barely know me." "I know enough," Beatrice said firmly. "I know you walked 2 hours in a snowstorm to help a stranger. I know you charged an elderly woman $50 for electrical work that any contractor would have billed at $300. I know you're raising a daughter on your own and doing a remarkable job of it. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Dan was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn his life was taking. "Could I see the carriage house before I decide?" "Of course," Beatrice said, rising from her chair. "Rebecca, could you bring the flashlight from the kitchen? The electricity in the carriage house hasn't been turned on in months." The carriage house sat at the back of the property, connected to the main house by a winding brick path lined with dormant rose bushes. Even in the gathering darkness, Dan could see it was a beautiful building, built in the same style as the main house, but scaled down to human proportions. Inside, their flashlight beams revealed hardwood floors covered in dust, a stone fireplace in the living room, and windows that would flood the space with natural light once they were cleaned. So the kitchen was indeed outdated, with appliances from the early 1990s and cabinet doors that hung slightly askew. But the bones of the place were solid, and Dan could envision exactly how to transform it into a real home. The upstairs has 2 bedrooms and a full bathroom, Rebecca said as they climbed a narrow staircase. Mrs. Thornton had it completely rewired and replumbed about 5 years ago, so all the major systems are in good shape. The master bedroom was spacious enough for a double bed and dresser, while the smaller room would be perfect for Zoe. Dan opened a window and looked out over gardens that, even in their winter dormancy, showed signs of careful planning and maintenance. "What do you think?" Beatrice asked as they made their way back downstairs. "It's beautiful," Dan said honestly. "More space than Zoe and I have ever had. But Mrs. Thornton, this is still a huge leap of faith on your part. What if I don't work out? What if—" "Then we'll figure out something else," she said simply. "But I don't think that will be necessary. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people, and my instincts tell me this arrangement will work well for everyone involved." Back in the main house, they settled in the sitting room where the fire had been rekindled. Beatrice pulled out a manila folder containing what looked like a formal job description and contract. "I've had my attorney draw up the basic terms," she said. "Take this home and look it over. The salary is competitive. Health insurance is included after 90 days, and there's a small education fund that could help if you decide to pursue that contractor's license you mentioned." Dan scanned the documents, his eyes widening at the salary figure. It was more than he'd made in his best year of construction work, and that was before factoring in free housing. "This is too much," he said. "You're paying me more than I'm worth." "You're worth far more than you realize," Beatrice replied. "And Dan, there's one more thing. The arrangement includes provisions for Zoe's after-school care. Rebecca has some flexibility in her schedule, and she's mentioned she'd enjoy having a young person around to help with. Of course, only if Zoe is comfortable with the idea." Dan felt his throat tighten with emotion. For 3 years, he'd been patching together childcare solutions, constantly worried about Zoe's safety and happiness while he worked. The idea of having reliable, caring supervision for his daughter was almost too good to believe. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll think about it," Beatrice said gently. "Talk it over with Zoe. Make sure she's comfortable with the idea of living here. This decision affects both of you, and her happiness is just as important as yours." As Dan drove back to Rick's house later that evening, the contract on the passenger seat beside him, he felt as if his entire world had shifted on its axis. 3 days ago, he'd been facing homelessness and desperation. Tonight, he was considering an opportunity that seemed too generous to be real. But as he thought about Beatrice's kind eyes and genuine concern for his welfare, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, good things really did happen to people who tried to do right by others. The question now was whether he had the courage to accept such an unexpected gift and trust that this new path would lead somewhere better than where he'd been walking alone. Dan spent 2 sleepless nights studying Beatrice's contract and wrestling with a decision that felt too momentous for one person to make alone. On Saturday morning, he sat Zoe down at Rick's kitchen table with a plate of pancakes and tried to explain the opportunity without overwhelming her 8-year-old understanding of how drastically their lives might change. "So we'd live in a little house behind a big house?" Zoe asked, cutting her pancakes into precise squares the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. "That's right. It's called a carriage house, and it has 2 bedrooms, so you'd have your own room for the first time." Zoe's eyes widened. My own room? With a door I can close? Yes, and windows that look out over a garden. There are even some fruit trees you could climb if Mrs. Thornton says it's okay. What's she like? Is she nice? Dan considered the question carefully. She's very kind and she's smart, and she treated me like I mattered, even though she doesn't really know me. I think you'd like her. Would I have to change schools? No, sweetheart. You'd stay right at Morning Glory Elementary with Miss Amy and all your friends. Zoe chewed thoughtfully on a bite of pancake. Daddy, are we poor? The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Dan had tried so hard to shield her from their financial struggles, but children notice more than adults gave them credit for. We don't have as much money as some people, he said, finally. But we have everything we really need, and we have each other. But this would give us more money? So you wouldn't look so worried all the time? Dan's heart clenched. Do I look worried a lot? Sometimes when you think I'm not watching, you get this crease right here, Zoe said, touching the space between her eyebrows, and you stare at papers like they're going to bite you. This job would help with that, yes, but only if you're comfortable with the idea. We're a team, Zoe. We make big decisions together. Zoe nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of what they were discussing. Can we go see the house? I want to meet Mrs. Thornton before I decide. That afternoon, Dan called Beatrice and asked if they could visit. She sounded delighted by the prospect of meeting Zoe and suggested they come for Sunday lunch the following day. Rebecca is making her famous apple cinnamon pancakes, Beatrice said. I have a feeling Zoe might enjoy those. Sunday arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made everything look freshly painted. Dan had spent extra time making sure both he and Zoe looked presentable, though he needn't have worried. Beatrice greeted them at the door, wearing a casual sweater and slacks, her manner warm and welcoming. You must be Zoe, she said, crouching down to the little girl's level. I'm so pleased to meet you. Your father told me wonderful things about you. Zoe, who could be shy around new adults, surprised Dan by stepping forward with confidence. He told me wonderful things about you too. He said you have a big house with lots of rooms. I certainly do. Would you like to see some of them after lunch? Over a meal that had Zoe declaring Rebecca's pancakes better than restaurant ones. The conversation flowed naturally. Beatrice asked Zoe about school, her favorite subjects, what she liked to do for fun. When Zoe mentioned that she'd always wanted to learn piano, Beatrice's face lit up. Well, there's a piano in the music room that hasn't been played in far too long. If you lived here, perhaps we could arrange for some lessons. Really? Zoe's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. You'd let me learn piano? I'd be delighted to hear music in this house again, Beatrice said. Though I should warn you, the piano is quite large and rather grand. It might seem intimidating at first. After lunch, Beatrice gave them a proper tour of the main house, showing Zoe rooms that sparkled with sunlight and possibilities. The library drew gasps of amazement from the little girl, who had never seen so many books in one place. The music room, with its gleaming baby grand piano, left her speechless. Can I touch it? She whispered. Of course, Beatrice said. Here, let me show you middle C. Watching his daughter's face as she pressed the key and heard the pure, clear note ring through the room, Dan felt something shift inside his chest. When was the last time Zoe had experienced something purely magical, without the undercurrent of worry that usually colored their lives? The tour of the carriage house went even better. Zoe ran from room to room, claiming the smaller upstairs bedroom as hers, and immediately beginning to plan where her stuffed animals would live and how she'd arrange her books. The view from her potential bedroom window showed a section of garden where a wooden swing hung from an ancient oak tree. Could I use the swing? She asked Beatrice. Whenever you like. though we might want to check the ropes first. That swing has been there since my grandson was your age. Something flickered across Beatrice's face at the mention of her grandson. A shadow of old pain that was quickly hidden, but not quite fast enough for Dan to miss. As they walked back toward the main house, a sleek black sedan pulled into the circular drive. Dan felt Beatrice tense beside him, her relaxed demeanor shifting to something more guarded. "That's my son," she said quietly. "I wasn't expecting him today." The man who emerged from the car was tall and well-dressed, with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from success and authority. He moved toward them with quick, purposeful strides, his expression darkening when he saw Dan and Zoe. "Mother," he said, his tone carefully controlled. "I tried calling, but no one answered. Rebecca said you were entertaining guests." "Andrew, what a surprise," Beatrice replied, her voice cooler than Dan had ever heard it. "I'd like you to meet Dan Cooper and his daughter Zoe. Dan is the gentleman who helped me when I got lost the other night." Andrew's eyes swept over Dan's. Sunday clothes and worn shoes with barely concealed disdain. "I see, and they're here because I invited them for lunch," Beatrice said firmly. "Dan, Zoe, this is my son Andrew." Dan extended his hand, which Andrew shook briefly and without warmth. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thornton." "Indeed." Andrew turned back to his mother. "Might I speak with you privately for a moment?" Beatrice's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of my guests." "I don't think that's appropriate." "Then perhaps your visit isn't well timed." The steel in Beatrice's voice would have made Dan step back, but Andrew seemed accustomed to his mother's displeasure. "Fine." Andrew's eyes fixed on Dan with unmistakable hostility. "Mr. Cooper, I hope you understand that my mother's kindness sometimes exceeds her judgment. She has a tendency to trust people who may not have her best interests at heart." "Andrew!" Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. "It's all right," Dan said evenly, though he could feel heat rising in his chest. "Mr. Thornton, I understand your concern for your mother. Any decent son would want to protect her from people who might take advantage. Exactly my point. But you should know that your mother isn't offering me charity. She's offering me a job, one that I'm qualified for, and that would benefit both of us. If you have concerns about my background or abilities, I'm happy to provide references." Andrew's smile was sharp and cold. "How convenient that you happen to find my mother wandering alone, confused and vulnerable. What are the odds?" "Andrew, that's enough," Beatrice said, her voice deadly quiet. But Dan stepped forward, his own anger finally breaking through his careful politeness. "You want to know the odds? The odds are that I was rushing to a job that would have paid my rent when I saw an elderly woman who needed help. The odds are that I gave up that money to make sure she got home safely, and now I'm sleeping on a friend's couch because I made that choice. So if you think I'm some kind of con artist, you might want to reconsider what kind of long-term plan involves making myself homeless." "Daddy," Zoe said quietly, tugging at his jacket. She could sense the tension even if she didn't understand its source. Dan immediately softened, putting a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart." Andrew looked between Dan and Zoe, his expression calculating. "And now, you're using the child to manipulate my mother's emotions. How predictable." "That's it," Beatrice said, her voice shaking with fury. "Andrew, you will apologize to my guests immediately, or you will leave my property." "Mother, you can't be serious about this arrangement. This man is clearly—" "This man," Beatrice interrupted, "showed me more kindness in 2 hours than you've shown me in 2 years. Now apologize or leave." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Andrew's face went through several expressions before settling on resigned anger. "Mr. Cooper," he said finally, the words clearly costing him effort, "I apologize for questioning your motives. I'm concerned about my mother's welfare, but I spoke out of turn." Dan nodded curtly. Apology accepted. Andrew turned to Beatrice, his expression softening slightly. "Mother, I worry about you. These episodes of confusion are getting more frequent, and I don't want someone taking advantage of that. I'm not helpless, Andrew, and my judgment is still sound, even if my memory occasionally falters." Beatrice's voice gentled fractionally. "I know you miss Michael. I know losing him changed everything between us. But punishing me for surviving when he didn't isn't going to bring him back." Andrew's composure cracked for just a moment, grief flickering across his features before the mask snapped back into place. "This isn't about Michael." "Everything is about Michael with you," Beatrice said sadly. "And until you're ready to let me help you grieve instead of pushing me away, we're going to keep having conversations like this." Andrew straightened his tie, his face closing off completely. "I should go. I have calls to make." He looked at Dan one more time. "Mr. Cooper, I hope you understand that I'll be taking a very personal interest in this arrangement." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Dan replied. After Andrew's car disappeared down the drive, Beatrice sank onto a garden bench, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," she said to Dan. "Andrew wasn't always so suspicious and angry. Losing Michael broke something in him that I don't know how to fix." "You don't need to explain," Dan said, settling beside her on the bench while Zoe explored the nearby flower beds. "Family is complicated. Are you having second thoughts about my offer? Andrew can be difficult when he sets his mind against something." Dan was quiet for a moment, watching Zoe examine a dormant rose bush with scientific curiosity. The encounter with Andrew had been unsettling, but it had also crystallized something for him. He'd been poor before, had faced disapproval and judgment from people who thought they were better than him. What he'd never had before was someone willing to stand up for him the way Beatrice had just done. "Mrs. Thornton," he said finally, "if you're still willing to take the risk on us, I'd like to accept your offer." Beatrice's face transformed with relief and joy. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm sure." Dan extended his hand to shake on it, but Beatrice surprised him by pulling him into a brief, warm hug. "Welcome home, Dan," she whispered. As they walked back toward the house to finalize the details, Zoe running ahead to explore her new domain, Dan felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the challenges ahead. Andrew Thornton clearly wasn't going to make this transition easy, and Dan suspected the man had resources and connections that could complicate their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But watching Beatrice's step grow lighter as they discussed move-in dates and renovation plans, seeing Zoe's infectious excitement about her own room and the possibility of piano lessons, Dan knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, they'd face them from a position of strength instead of desperation, surrounded by people who wanted to see them succeed rather than waiting for them to fail. 2 weeks into their new life at the Thornton estate, Dan woke before dawn to the sound of steady rain drumming against the carriage house windows. He lay in bed for a moment, still amazed by the luxury of waking up without immediate worry about rent or utilities. Beside him on the nightstand, his phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number, all placed after midnight. He slipped downstairs quietly, not wanting to wake Zoe, and returned the calls from the kitchen while coffee brewed. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, and entirely unwelcome. "Mr. Cooper, this is Detective Margaret Walsh with the Morning Glory Police Department. I need to speak with you about your employment arrangement with Mrs. Beatrice Thornton." Dan's stomach dropped. "Is Mrs. Thornton all right? As far as I know, she's fine, but I've received some concerns about potential elder abuse, and I need to ask you a few questions. Could you come down to the station this morning?" "Elder abuse?" Dan's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "Detective, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "I'm sure there has been, Mr. Cooper. That's why I'd like to clear this up as quickly as possible. Say, 9 o'clock? After hanging up, Dan stood in his kitchen. His kitchen, he reminded himself, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens while his coffee grew cold. He didn't need 3 guesses to figure out who had made those calls to the police. The question was how to handle this without dragging Beatrice into what was clearly Andrew's attempt to sabotage their arrangement. At 8:45, Dan knocked on the back door of the main house. Rebecca answered, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. "Dan, good morning. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Is Mrs. Thornton awake? I need to speak with her about something urgent." Rebecca's expression grew concerned. "She's having breakfast in the morning room. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet." Beatrice looked up from her newspaper as Dan entered, her face brightening in the way that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. She wore a lavender robe over her nightgown, her silver hair pinned back loosely, and looked every inch the gracious lady of the house. "Dan, how lovely. Would you like some coffee? Rebecca makes it stronger than I do." "Mrs. Thornton, I need to tell you something before I leave for a while this morning." Dan accepted the offered cup but remained standing. "The police want to speak with me about our arrangement. Someone has apparently filed a complaint about potential elder abuse." The newspaper rustled as Beatrice set it down with deliberate care. "I see. And you believe my son made this complaint?" "I can't prove it, but the timing seems suspicious." "Sit down, Dan." Beatrice's voice carried quiet authority. "Rebecca, could you give us a moment?" After Rebecca left, Beatrice studied Dan's face with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're afraid this will end our arrangement. I'm afraid Andrew has more power to cause problems than I anticipated. And I'm afraid of what this kind of investigation might do to your reputation, regardless of the outcome. My reputation has survived worse scandals than a false accusation from my own son." Beatrice reached across the small table and covered Dan's hand with her own. "But I'm more concerned about yours. Andrew can be ruthless when he sets his mind to something. I can handle whatever questions they have. I've got nothing to hide. I know that. But you should also know that I've already called my attorney. Richard Sterling will meet you at the police station and make sure this inquiry is handled properly." Dan started to protest. "Mrs. Thornton, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm insisting. Richard has been the family lawyer for 20 years, and he knows exactly how to deal with Andrew's more vindictive impulses." At the Morning Glory police station, a grey brick building that had seen better decades, Dan found himself in an interview room across from Detective Walsh, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to sorting truth from fiction. Richard Sterling, a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit, sat beside Dan, taking notes in a leather portfolio. "Mr. Cooper," Detective Walsh began, "I want to be clear that this is just a preliminary inquiry. We received a complaint alleging that you might be financially exploiting Mrs. Thornton, taking advantage of her cognitive decline for personal gain." "That's completely false," Dan said firmly. "I'm sure it is, but I need to ask some questions to document that for our report." Detective Walsh consulted her notes. "How long have you known Mrs. Thornton?" "About 3 weeks. I helped her when she got lost downtown, and she offered me employment afterward." "And this employment involves living on her property?" "Yes. In the carriage house. I maintain the grounds and handle repairs around the estate in exchange for housing and a salary." Detective Walsh made notes as they talked. "The complaint suggests that Mrs. Thornton's judgment may be compromised by early-stage dementia, and that you're aware of this condition and using it to your advantage." Richard Sterling leaned forward. "Detective, I've known Mrs. Thornton for 2 decades. While she occasionally experiences minor memory issues consistent with her age, she remains mentally competent and fully capable of making her own decisions. Her physician, Dr. Donna Evans, has provided documentation to that effect. Mr. Cooper, Detective Walsh continued, are you aware of Mrs. Thornton's financial status? I know she's wealthy. The house and grounds make that obvious. And you're not seeking any control over her finances or property? Absolutely not. Our arrangement is strictly employment-based. I receive a salary for specific work, nothing more. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Dan's background to the specific terms of his employment. Through it all, Richard Sterling provided documentation that painted a clear picture of a legitimate business arrangement between consenting adults. One final question, Detective Walsh said as she closed her notebook. The complainant mentioned that you have a criminal record. Is that accurate? Dan felt his face flush. I was arrested twice when I was 19. Bar fights, nothing serious. I paid fines and did community service, but that was over 10 years ago. And Mrs. Thornton is aware of this history? Yes, I told her about it during our initial conversations. Detective Walsh nodded and stood. Mr. Cooper, based on this interview and the documentation provided by Mr. Sterling, I see no evidence of elder abuse or financial exploitation. Mrs. Thornton appears to be a competent adult who has made a business decision she's entitled to make. We'll be closing this inquiry. Outside the police station, Richard Sterling walked Dan to his car through the continuing rain. That went as well as could be expected, the lawyer said. But Dan, you should know that Andrew Thornton isn't going to stop here. This was just his opening move. What do you mean? He's going to try other approaches. He might attempt to have his mother declared incompetent, or he could make trouble with your daughter's school, or find ways to complicate your employment through bureaucratic channels. Andrew has connections throughout this county, and he's not above using them. Dan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November rain. So what do I do? You do your job well, document everything, and remember that Beatrice Thornton didn't build her fortune by being easily intimidated. She's tougher than she looks, and she's chosen to trust you. Don't let Andrew's harassment make you doubt that choice. That afternoon, Dan threw himself into repair work with an intensity born of frustration and determination. He fixed a persistent leak in the main house basement, replaced several loose floorboards in the conservatory, and started planning the renovation of the carriage house kitchen. Physical labor had always been his way of processing stress, and today he needed the clarity that came from solving problems with his hands. He was replacing a broken window latch in the library when Zoe burst through the door, still wearing her school backpack and breathing hard from running. Daddy, there were policemen at school today asking Principal Brown questions about us. Dan set down his screwdriver and pulled Zoe into his arms. What kind of questions, sweetheart? I don't know exactly, but Susie's mom is the secretary, and she told Susie they wanted to know if you were taking good care of me and if I seemed happy. Zoe pulled back to look at his face. Are we in trouble? No, Zoe. Some people are just making sure you're safe and happy. Which you are, right? I'm the happiest I've ever been. I love our house and I love Mrs. Thornton, and Rebecca is teaching me to make cookies. Zoe's expression grew worried. But why would anyone think you weren't taking good care of me? Before Dan could answer, Beatrice appeared in the library doorway. She'd been having tea with some old friends when Zoe arrived, but she'd clearly sensed the distress in the room. Zoe, dear, how was school today? She asked with studied casualness. Weird. There were police there asking about Daddy and me. Beatrice's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I see. Well, sometimes grown-ups ask questions to make sure children are safe and happy. It's nothing for you to worry about. That's what Daddy said too. Your father is a very wise man. Now, would you like to help me finish entertaining my guests? Mrs. Henderson brought pictures of her new grandbaby, and I think you'd enjoy seeing them." After Zoe left with Beatrice, Dan's phone rang. The caller ID showed his former landlord, Mrs. Jackson. "Dan, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I had a strange visit today. A man claiming to be conducting a background check on you for potential employment. He asked a lot of questions about why you were evicted, whether you'd ever been violent or unstable. What did you tell him? The truth, that you were a model tenant who fell behind on rent through no fault of your own, and that I was sorry to lose you. But Dan, something about this man didn't sit right with me. He seemed more interested in finding dirt than in verifying your character. Did he give you a name?" "Called himself David Chen, said he was with some employment verification company. But when I asked for identification, he got evasive and left quickly." Dan thanked Mrs. Jackson and hung up, his anger building with each revelation of Andrew's campaign against him. It was one thing to challenge him directly, but involving Zoe's school and fabricating background checks crossed a line that Dan wasn't willing to tolerate. He found Beatrice in the sitting room with her guests, playing the gracious hostess while Zoe showed off her growing piano skills. The normalcy of the scene, elderly women sharing gossip over tea while a child practiced scales, made Andrew's vindictive behavior seem even more petty and destructive. After the guests left and Zoe was upstairs doing homework, Dan told Beatrice about the additional harassment. She listened with growing fury, her composure finally cracking when he described the fake background check. "That's it," she said, reaching for her phone. "Richard, it's Beatrice. I need you to contact Andrew immediately and inform him that if he continues this harassment campaign against Dan Cooper, I will pursue legal action against him for defamation and interference with contractual relationships. No, I don't care if he's my son. He's crossed the line." She hung up and turned to Dan, her eyes blazing with protective anger. "I'm sorry you're bearing the brunt of my family's dysfunction. Andrew is grieving, but that doesn't excuse this behavior." "I can handle Andrew," Dan said quietly, "but if he starts affecting Zoe's sense of security, that changes everything." "He won't," Beatrice said with finality. "I promise you that. This family has already lost too much to grief and stubbornness. I won't let Andrew destroy something good just because he's afraid to believe in it." As evening settled over the estate, Dan helped Zoe with her homework at the kitchen table, while rain continued to streak the windows. Despite the day's upheavals, there was peace in this simple domestic scene, a sense of rightness that no amount of external pressure could diminish. "Daddy," Zoe said as she worked on her math problems, "are we going to stay here forever?" "I don't know about forever, sweetheart, but we're going to stay as long as Mrs. Thornton needs us, and we're happy here." "Good," Zoe said with satisfaction, "because I like having a piano to practice on, and Rebecca promised to teach me how to make her apple pie next weekend." Looking at his daughter's contented face bent over her homework, Dan felt his resolve strengthen. Andrew Thornton could bring whatever weapons he had to this fight, but he would not succeed in destroying the first real home Zoe had ever known. Some things were worth fighting for, and the chance to give his daughter a childhood filled with music and laughter and the security of being truly wanted was at the top of that list. 6 months later, the cherry trees on the Thornton estate were in full bloom, their pink and white petals drifting across the manicured lawns like confetti, celebrating spring's arrival. Dan stood in the renovated carriage house kitchen, admiring the new cabinets he'd built and installed over the winter months, when his phone rang with news that would change everything once again. "Mr. Cooper, this is Dr. Evans at Morning Glory General. Mrs. Thornton has been admitted to the hospital after experiencing what appears to be a stroke. You're listed as her emergency contact." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of anxious thoughts and half-formed prayers. Dan had grown closer to Beatrice over the past months than he'd thought possible. their relationship evolving from employer and employee to something resembling family. She'd become the grandmother Zoe had never known, and for Dan, she'd become the mother figure he'd lost too early in his own life. Rebecca met him in the hospital waiting room, her usual composure cracked by worry and exhaustion. "They don't know how extensive the damage is yet," she said without preamble. She was lucid when the ambulance arrived, but confused about recent events. "The doctors are running tests. Where's Andrew? On his way from Philadelphia. He should be here within the hour." Rebecca's expression darkened. "Dan, there's something you need to know. If Beatrice's condition is serious, Andrew will likely try to assume control of her affairs. He's been pushing for guardianship proceedings for months." Before Dan could respond, a doctor in green scrubs approached them. Dr. Evans was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the gentle manner that came from years of delivering difficult news to worried families. "Are you Mrs. Thornton's family?" "I'm Rebecca Parker, her caretaker, and this is Dan Cooper, her estate manager. We're the closest thing to family she has right now." Dr. Evans nodded. "Mrs. Thornton has suffered a mild stroke affecting the left side of her brain. The good news is that she's stable and responsive. The concerning news is that the stroke seems to have accelerated some of the cognitive issues she was already experiencing." "What does that mean exactly?" Dan asked. Her short-term memory has been significantly affected. She remembers events from years ago clearly, but struggles with recent information. She's been asking for someone named Michael and seems confused about current circumstances. Dan's heart sank. Michael was Beatrice's deceased grandson, and her asking for him suggested the stroke had taken her back to an earlier time in her life. "Can we see her?" Rebecca asked. "For a few minutes, but I should warn you, she may not recognize you immediately. Stroke patients often experience disorientation as their brain begins to heal." Beatrice lay in the hospital bed looking smaller and more fragile than Dan had ever seen her. Her silver hair was disheveled, and there was a slight droop to the left side of her face that hadn't been there that morning when she'd waved goodbye from her garden. "Mrs. Thornton," Rebecca said softly, taking her hand. "It's Rebecca. Dan is here too." Beatrice's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as she took in their faces. "Rebecca, what are you doing here? And who is this young man?" Dan felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. After 6 months of shared meals, conversations, and quiet evenings spent planning improvements to the estate, she didn't recognize him at all. "This is Dan, Mrs. Thornton. He lives in the carriage house with his daughter Zoe. Remember Zoe? She's been learning piano." Confusion clouded Beatrice's features. "I don't understand. Why would strangers be living in the carriage house? Robert always said we should keep that space available for family." "Mrs. Thornton," Dan said gently, "I'm Dan Cooper. I've been working for you, taking care of the estate. We've been friends." Beatrice studied his face with the polite attention of someone trying to place a stranger. "I'm sorry, young man, but I don't believe we've met, though you seem very nice." She turned to Rebecca with sudden urgency. "Where is Michael? He was supposed to come for lunch today." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "Mrs. Thornton, Michael passed away 3 years ago. Do you remember?" The news hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Her face crumpled with fresh grief, as if she were learning of her grandson's death for the first time. "No, that can't be right. He was just here yesterday, telling me about his plans for college." Dan stepped back from the bed, overwhelmed by the sight of this strong, dignified woman reduced to confusion and sorrow. The Beatrice who had defended him against Andrew's accusations, who had given Zoe piano lessons and taught her to make cookies, who had become the anchor of their small family, that woman seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone lost in the corridors of her own failing memory. "I should go," he whispered to Rebecca. "This is too much for her right now." "Mr. Cooper?" Dan turned to find Andrew Thornton standing in the doorway, still wearing his business suit from what had clearly been a hasty trip from Philadelphia. For once his usual hostility was replaced by genuine concern for his mother. "How is she?" Andrew asked, moving past Dan to his mother's bedside. "Andrew!" Beatrice's face brightened with relief and recognition. "Thank goodness you're here. There are strangers in the house, and Rebecca is telling me terrible things about Michael." Andrew took his mother's hand, his expression softening in a way Dan had never seen before. "It's all right, Mother. I'm here now. We'll sort everything out." He looked up at Dan and Rebecca, his meaning clear. "I think my mother needs rest. Perhaps you could give us some privacy?" In the hospital corridor, Rebecca slumped against the wall with exhaustion. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "I think it might," Dan admitted. "Andrew's her son, her legal next of kin. If she doesn't remember our arrangement, the stroke might be temporary," Rebecca said hopefully. "Sometimes patients recover their memories as they heal." But Dan could see the doubt in her eyes, the same fear he was feeling. They both knew that Andrew had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to remove them from Beatrice's life. The next few days confirmed Dan's worst fears. Beatrice's condition remained stable, but her memory showed no signs of returning. She remembered Rebecca as her caretaker, but seemed to think she'd just been hired. She had no memory of Dan at all, and when Andrew brought up the subject of strangers living on the property, she agreed that it seemed inappropriate. "I don't understand why Robert would have allowed such an arrangement," she said during one of Dan's visits, speaking of her deceased husband as if he was still alive. "We've always been careful about who we trust." Andrew wasted no time in asserting control. Within a week, he'd filed papers to assume temporary guardianship of his mother's affairs, citing her diminished capacity and the need to protect her from potential exploitation. "You understand this isn't personal," he said to Dan during a tense meeting in Beatrice's hospital room. "But my mother clearly isn't capable of making sound decisions right now. I have to protect her interests." "And what does that mean for my family?" Dan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I'm afraid your employment is terminated, effective immediately. I'll give you 2 weeks to find alternative housing and move out of the carriage house." Dan felt the familiar weight of financial anxiety settling on his shoulders, heavier now because Zoe had grown so attached to their life on the estate. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that the woman who had become her surrogate grandmother no longer remembered their existence? "Andrew, please," Rebecca interjected. "Your mother was happy with this arrangement. Dan has been nothing but professional and caring in his work here." "My mother was clearly not thinking clearly when she made these decisions," Andrew replied coldly. "I won't have strangers taking advantage of her condition." That evening, Dan sat Zoe down at their kitchen table one more time to explain another major change in their lives. She took the news with the resilience of a child who had learned early that life was unpredictable. But he could see the sadness in her eyes. "Will Mrs. Thornton get better?" she asked. "Will she remember us?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people's memories come back and sometimes they don't. But that doesn't mean our time here wasn't special. We'll always have those memories, even if she can't share them with us right now. Can we still visit her?" Dan hesitated. Andrew had made it clear that their presence upset his mother, who became agitated when confronted with people she couldn't remember. "We'll see. Right now, she needs to focus on getting better." Over the next week, Dan began the familiar process of packing their belongings and searching for new housing. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was in a better position now than he'd been 6 months earlier. Beatrice's generous salary had allowed him to save money, and he had solid references for his work. But leaving felt like losing family. On their Last day at the estate, Dan was loading boxes into Rick's truck when he noticed a taxi pulling up the circular drive. To his surprise, Beatrice emerged from the back seat, moving slowly but under her own power. She'd been released from the hospital 2 days earlier to a rehabilitation facility, but apparently had other plans. "Mrs. Thornton," Rebecca said, rushing to help her. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Sunset Manor." "I wanted to come home," Beatrice said firmly, "and I wanted to see the garden one more time before—" She trailed off, noticing Dan loading boxes. "What's happening here?" "We're moving out," Dan said gently. "Your son felt it would be better for your recovery if we found somewhere else to live." Beatrice studied his face with the same polite confusion she'd shown in the hospital. But then something shifted in her expression. "You're the man who walked me home in the snow." Dan's heart leaped. "You remember?" "I remember kindness," she said slowly. "I remember someone who stopped when others walked by. I remember feeling safe." She looked around at the boxes, then back at Dan. "And I remember thinking that good people are rare and should be treasured when found." Tears sprang to Dan's eyes. "Mrs. Thornton, I may not remember everything clearly," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "but I remember the feeling of being cared for without condition, and I remember deciding that such a person should never have to worry about having a home." She turned to Rebecca. "Call Richard Sterling. Tell him I want to speak with him immediately. About my affairs." "Mother, you can't." Andrew's voice came from behind them as he hurried up the driveway, clearly having followed her from the rehabilitation facility. "I can and I will," Beatrice said with a flash of her old authority. "I may be old, Andrew, and my memory may be failing, but I am still competent to make decisions about my own property." What followed was a tense legal battle that lasted 3 weeks. But Beatrice's physicians testified that while she had suffered memory loss, she retained the capacity to make reasoned decisions about her affairs. More importantly, she had prepared for this possibility months earlier, working with Richard Sterling to create legal protections for Dan and Rebecca that couldn't be easily overturned. In the end, Andrew's guardianship petition was denied, and Beatrice's original employment arrangements were upheld. But more than that, she had Richard draft new papers ensuring that Dan and Zoe would always have a home on the estate, regardless of what happened to her in the future. "Why?" Dan asked her during one of their conversations as she recovered at home. "You don't really remember me, do you?" "Not the details," Beatrice admitted, "but I remember the essence of who you are. And sometimes that's enough." A year later, Dan stood in the same spot where he'd first encountered Beatrice at the Pine Street bus stop. The town had installed a small memorial bench there, honoring the late Robert Thornton's contributions to Morning Glory's development. But for Dan, it would always be the place where his life changed direction because he chose kindness over convenience. Zoe ran ahead to the playground across the street, her piano lesson bag bouncing against her hip. She was 9 now, confident, and happy in a way that reminded Dan daily of the gift they'd been given. Beatrice's memory had never fully returned, but their relationship had evolved into something even deeper, a bond based not on shared history, but on mutual care and respect that transcended the quirks of failing memory. "Daddy, look!" Zoe called. Showing off her ability to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" on the playground xylophone. "Mrs. Thornton will be so proud when I show her tomorrow." Dan smiled and waved back, thinking about the dinner they'd share that evening. The 3 generations gathered around Beatrice's dining room table like the family they'd chosen to become. Andrew visited occasionally now, his hostility gradually replaced by grudging acceptance of an arrangement that clearly made his mother happy. As the sun set over Morning Glory, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a simple choice to help a stranger, a decision that had cost him everything he thought he had and given him everything he'd never dared to hope for. Sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning or strategic thinking, but from listening to the quiet voice that whispered, "This person needs help," and having the courage to act on it, regardless of the cost. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice would echo back to you multiplied, creating ripples of kindness that would reshape not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. In the distance, the lights of the Thornton estate began to twinkle against the darkening sky, calling them home to the place where love had grown from the simple act of one person reaching out to another in their moment of need. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.